Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Horace Walpole's novel, The Castle of Otranto. Now, those of us who, like me, love horror, owe Horace Walpole a huge debt because The Castle of Otranto basically invents the Gothic, not goth kids. They were largely invented by Robert Smith. But the Gothic as a genre. So Castle of Otranto comes out in 1764. So it's really the earliest of what we would now call the Gothic novels. And it includes a lot of the standard things that you expect to see within the Gothic as a genre. So for a setting, we've got a somewhat decrepit castle. We've got some spooky underground caves. We've got ghosts, we've got the supernatural, we've got a overbearing lord, we've got some sexual shenanigans that go on, we've got this overriding sense of doom, we've got a prophecy of destruction within the first page of the novel, right? Chapter 1, by the bottom of the first page, this is the Penguin Classics, 3 Gothic novels reprinting. We have this prophecy that the castle and lordship of Otranto shall pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. What does it mean? Nobody knows, but it's a prophecy of doom. So we've got all of these spooky, supernatural, creepy elements that become big staples of the Gothic as a genre. So things like Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These kinds of stories have these similar dark, spooky, ominous elements. Not all of them have the same things. For instance, Jekyll and Hyde doesn't have a castle, but it does have sort of subterranean, like, back alleys and sort of darkened passages of Victorian East London. And so we've got all of these elements. And then they, of course, get carried forward into horror. So you think about the Universal monster movies. Again, things like Frankenstein, things like the Wolfman, these Dracula as well. These things that come up really in the 30s into the 40s, where you start to have the emergence of horror with the Universal monster movie as a film genre specifically. But then they get carried forward even through to today. We're still seeing elements of the Gothic, particularly in film, right? There are episodes in the Harry Potter series that are very much Gothic. There's Gothic influences in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Stephen Norrington's film, Gothic inspired. All of these things, we're still seeing it today. So again, we owe Horace Walpole this great debt for creating the foundations that lead to the development not only of the Gothic, but of horror more generally. So, what's the actual story of the Castle of Otranto? Well, you've got Manfred, who is the Prince of Otranto. He has one son, Conrad, and a daughter, Matilda, who he does not give a fuck about because she's a daughter, she's not going to inherit, she's not going to carry on the kingdom, whatever. And then his wife is Hippolyta. Conrad pretty much immediately gets killed off. He is crushed to death by a giant helmet that comes flying in from parts unknown and just crushes him to death. Conrad was supposed to marry Isabella, who's the daughter of Frederick, who's off, I think, crusading or something. He's off doing something. No one knows where he is. They think he might be dead, but they're not sure. So Isabella was supposed to marry Conrad. Now Conrad is dead, which kind of kneecaps that plan. So Manfred, realizing that his son and heir is dead, Hippolyta is not going to be able to give him more sons, decides that he's going to divorce Hippolyta and he is going to marry Isabella instead of Conrad. He's going to marry Isabella instead of Conrad marrying her. You know what I meant anyway. But, so that's his plan. Isabella is not keen on this plan, A, because Conrad, she wasn't that keen on Conrad either, but Manfred's a reasonably cruel older dude, and Isabella's this like lovely young woman who's all virtuous and whatnot. And so she's not really that keen on marrying him. And so she sort of escapes. She flees through these subterranean tunnels to a monastery run by Friar Jerome, who basically gives her sanctuary. While that's occurring, you've also got this other guy named Theodore. We don't know his name is Theodore till about halfway through the novel. But he's a peasant who has been accused by Manfred of being the sorcerer who crushed Conrad with a giant helmet. Manfred orders that Theodore be locked up by having the giant helmet put on top of him in the courtyard, and then basically just letting him starve to death. That does not work because the edge of the helmet or something like crushes through the ground, and so Theodore is able to get down into the subterranean caverns where he helps Isabella escape. Then he's found by Manfred and his servants and whatnot, and they like take him back upstairs. Manfred is going to execute him, but Matilda, Manfred's daughter, sees him, sees Theodore. She falls instantly in love with Theodore. There's some commotion. And then later, Matilda decides that she is going to go and release Theodore from the tower in which he's being imprisoned, another Gothic element. And he falls instantly in love with her. Matilda sends Theodore out to the convent. While that happens, a knight shows up on behalf of Frederick, and basically there's a lot of antagonism between Frederick and Manfred. Well, Frederick's knight, who we actually later find out is Frederick, so I'm just going to keep calling him Frederick to simplify things. Basically, the accusation is that Manfred has illegally usurped Otranto, that it is in fact the inheritance of Frederick, and that Manfred needs to give up Frederick's daughter Isabella to him immediately, which of course Manfred can't do because Isabella's in the convent. So that all happens. There's some sort of back and forths about that. And then basically news breaks that Isabella is out somewhere. Like she's escaped. She's left the convent. So everybody goes out looking for her. Theodore happens to find her. He has now been sort of armored and armed by Matilda so that he could go out and be safe. And her father would have a harder time killing him. So he finds Isabella. They go into a cave to basically like seek shelter, and he's going to stand heroically at the door and challenge all comers. The first comer happens to be Frederick, who is still disguised at this point, so they don't know that it's Frederick, but also Theodore didn't know who Frederick was anyway, so they fight, and then even though Theodore is a peasant and Frederick is an experienced knight, Frederick is wounded. Isabella basically comes out and she's like, oh no, it's my dad. And so they have that whole shtick. They take Theodore back to the castle, or they take Frederick back to the castle. Theodore accompanies them. Frederick falls in love with Matilda and he wants to marry her. And so Manfred comes up with this plan where basically they'll like daughter swap, where Manfred will marry Frederick's daughter Isabella and Frederick will marry Manfred's daughter Matilda. And then that will sort of wipe out the competing inheritance claims. Manfred gets what he wants. For her part, Hippolyta is basically like, oh, the will of my husband. I must obey my husband. I'll retire and just go to a monastery and weep until I die. So that all happens. Then, at the end, it's basically revealed that Friar Jerome is actually Theodore's father, and Theodore is the descendant of Alfonso the Good, who was a previous ruler of Otranto. Alfonso the Good had been like this great sort of idealized ruler, and he died without children, and so Manfred's ancestors took over. Basically, we find out by forging a letter from Alfonso, leaving the principality to them. And so Theodore is now back. He is the descendant of Alfonso. He gets to basically take over the kingdom. While all of this stuff is happening, there's some bits and pieces with, like, at one point, the I guess, ghost of Manfred's ancestor climbs out of a picture in the Great Hall and then leads Manfred to this door and then disappears through the locked door. There are sightings of these giant body parts all around the castle, like giant armored feet and hands and things like this. Turns out that is the ghost of Alfonso, because at the end of the novel, after sort of everything has been revealed, what it says here. Oh, also, Manfred mistakenly believes that Isabella, who he regards now as kind of his fiancée, has snuck out to meet Theodore, and so he sneaks up and stabs her in the heart. Problem is, it's actually not Isabella, it's Matilda. So he murders his own daughter, and that sort of precipitates the whole crisis at the end. And what it says here is, a clap of thunder at that instant shook the castle to its foundations. The earth rocked, and the clank of more than mortal armor was heard behind. Frederick and Jerome thought the last day was at hand. The latter, forcing Theodore along with them, rushed into the court. The moment Theodore appeared, the walls of the castle behind Manfred were thrown down with a mighty force, and the form of Alfonso, dilated to an immense magnitude, appeared in the center of the ruins. "Behold in Theodore the true heir of Alfonso," said the vision. And having pronounced these words, accompanied by a clap of thunder, it ascended solemnly toward heaven, where the clouds parting asunder, the form of St. Nicholas was seen and received Alfonso's shade. They were soon wrapped with mortal eyes in a blaze of glory. So yeah, that also gives you a pretty good sense of the prose of this. This is very purple prose. Very 1760s, very 18th century. It is, yeah. But this is one of those elements where again, we have this supernatural occurrence that sort of wraps things up in this weird way. So all of that happens. The other thing I want to talk about with the Castle of Otranto, because I think this is a really interesting bit, is the original title page and the preface to the first edition, because this is the original title page. So what it says here is The Castle of Otranto, a story translated by William Marshall, gentleman, from the original Italian of Onofiurio Muralto, Canon of the Church of St. Nicholas at Otranto, London, printed for Thomas Lowndes in Fleet Street, 1765? I think that's 1765 in Roman numeral, but I haven't really worked it out. So what's interesting here is that William Marshall is not Horace Walpole. That is not the same name, as you may very, very cunningly have deduced. So what happens is in the preface to the first edition, we have this setup, right? It says, the following work was found in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. It was printed at Naples in the black letter in the year 1529. How much sooner it was written does not appear. The principal incidents are such as were believed in the darkest ages of Christianity, but the language and conduct have nothing that savors of barbarism. The style is the purest Italian. If the story was written near the time when it was supposed to have happened, it would have been between 1095, the era of the First Crusade, and 1243, the date of the last, or not long afterwards. There is no other circumstance in the work that can lead us to guess at the period in which the scene is laid. So this is a faux antiquarianism, right? Because this is not an ancient novel. Walpole writes this in the 1760s, probably, I'm assuming. I don't know how long he spent writing it. But Walpole publishes this. This is an original work in 1764. It's not an ancient Italian manuscript that somebody has translated. But this becomes one of the things that's very common with Gothic novels, is this faux antiquarianism, right? This pretense that this is an ancient work, a medieval work particularly, and often it is assigned to an exotic locale, like Italy. Not that Italy is necessarily super exotic, but this actually goes back, this connects back to the Renaissance era, the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, right? Because in Shakespeare, if you wanted a tragedy, if you wanted people to indulge their passions and then murder each other, you set it in Italy or in Spain or in wherever, Greece, wherever it is. You set it in the Mediterranean. You don't set a tragedy in England, in the Elizabethan period, in the Jacobean period. And so there is this sort of element with the Gothic as well, that it's often these distant foreign locations. You think about something like Dracula, right? It starts in Transylvania. It starts in what's now Romania. It does not start in England, even though there are elements in England. So this is a very, very common thing. Not universal, but it's common. In part because it creates this sort of distance from the reading audience. But then, interestingly enough, in the preface to the second edition, Walpole just abandons it completely. The gimmick is gone. And his explanation for why is really fascinating. Because basically what he says at the beginning of the preface to the second edition is, the favorable manner in which this little piece has been received by the public calls upon the author to explain the grounds on which he composed it. But before he opens these motives, it is fit that he should ask pardon of his readers for having offered his work to them under the borrowed personage of a translator. As diffidence of his own abilities, and the novelty of the attempt were his sole inducements to assume that disguise, he flatters himself he shall appear excusable. He resigned his performance to the impartial judgment of the public, determined to let it perish in obscurity if disapproved, nor meaning to avow such a trifle unless better judges should pronounce that he might own it without a blush. So basically he says, hey man, I'm fucking inventing an entire new genre here. If people hate it, I don't want to get blamed. But because people liked it, because the Castle of Otranto was a success, and people were like, whoa, this is crazy, we've never read anything like this. Walpole felt like he could now be like, yeah, I wrote it. So it's this very interesting sort of trick. I say trick, it's not really a trick, but it's this very interesting thing where he sort of built in this mechanism to shield his reputation, and then when there was no need to, he's like, yay, it was me, give me all the royalty checks.